Even inside the courtroom, Officer Rick Lawton shouted straight into the face of a black female judge. "Cheap costume, who do you think you are?" He chewed his gum loudly, slammed his hand on the table, his eyes aggressive, as if he wanted to crush the judge, but he had no idea that the woman standing before him was once a federal ethics advisor, and now held the authority to suspend any officer with a record of violence. What punishment awaits those who believe they have the right to trample others, just because they assume silence will last forever? Watch until the end to find the answer. Rick Lawton sat in the plaintiff's chair like he owned the room. His spine leaned just far enough back to suggest he wasn't here for justice, but for sport. One hand flexed casually, tugging at the cuff of his shirt like a bored cop checking his watch in a precinct briefing. The other hand twirled a wad of gum in his mouth, as if this courtroom, packed with tension and protocol, was nothing but a side act in a show he'd already decided he would headline. The double doors swung open without announcement. Without flourish, Maya Rawlins entered. Not a sound preceded her, not a shuffle of feet, not a rustle of robes, just the cut of red against dull beige and dark oak. Her judicial gown wasn't the standard issue black, it was crimson, sharp and burning, like a verdict set on fire. The entire room froze, not because it wanted to, but because something in her pace, in her upright carriage, in the pure velocity of her stillness, demanded it. Rick didn't stand. Didn't blink. He smirked, popped the gum between his teeth, and muttered loud enough for everyone in the first 5 rows to hear, "What's this, Halloween in July?" He scanned her robe from shoulder to hem, eyes resting just below her chin with a sneer. The courtroom murmured, a few coughs cloaking nervous energy, but Maya Rawlins said nothing. She didn't flinch. She took the bench with the grace of a judge and the weight of a warning. Her chair, elevated a good half-meter above Rick's, caught the ceiling light just right so that the edge of her crimson robe flared in a single beam like a wound that refused to close. She stared at Rick. Not coldly, not even angrily. She stared with the precision of someone identifying a specimen under glass. 30 full seconds. No papers shuffled, no gavel dropped, just her eyes locked on his, stripping the man of every defense he thought swagger could buy. Rick's smile held, but barely. The gum slowed in his jaw, his smirk faltered in its depth, just enough for those paying close attention to see a flicker of recognition that maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be the farce he'd expected. There was no opening statement, no ceremonial introduction of the bench. Maya simply sat, the silence extending itself like a slow suffocation. Rick adjusted his seat, not because it was uncomfortable, but because suddenly he was. His fingers tapped the table twice, then 3 times, seeking rhythm, control, anything that might put the spotlight back where he wanted it, on him. But the spotlight didn't move. Maya remained still. No blinking, no throat clearing, just that stare, quiet, firm, unblinking, pushing every ounce of his bravado back into his chest, where it coiled like smoke with nowhere to escape. A bailiff shifted in the corner. A stenographer clicked a key. That was all. No one spoke, because in that moment the courtroom belonged to Maya, not because she claimed it, but because she never once asked for permission. Rick leaned forward, elbows wide, claiming space like a bully on a playground. "So, what now?" he said, voice raised just enough to fracture the silence. "Are we going to pretend this circus is legitimate, or do you want to skip to the part where you lecture me about justice and inclusivity?" Maya didn't move, didn't speak. The gum in Rick's mouth made a slow crack as he bit down. "You think that robe scares me?" he continued. "You think walking in here looking like a bottle of hot sauce gives you the moral high ground?" Still no response. Only the echo of his voice faded beneath the courtroom's breathing walls. Maya reached for the gavel, not to bang it, but to rest her fingers on it, as if reminding the room whose hand would end or begin the next sentence. Rick chuckled, low and theatrical, and leaned back. "Tell me, Judge," he said, drawing out the word like a dare, "did you pick that outfit to match your temper, or to distract from your credentials?" Again, Maya said nothing. She didn't reach for the docket. She didn't acknowledge the insult. She simply kept her eyes trained on him, the way one watches a lit fuse, not out of fear, but to measure the time until ignition. Rick shifted again. His knee bounced once. A tiny betrayal. He masked it with another smile, this one too wide, the kind that shows gums and desperation in equal measure. "You know," he said, voice straining toward amusement, "I've been in real situations and kicked down doors, pulled men twice my size to the pavement, led raids with real stakes, and now I'm sitting here being judged by a woman who walks in dressed for a revolution." Still, no reaction. Maya finally moved. Slowly, she picked up a single sheet of paper from the stack in front of her. She didn't read from it. She didn't announce its contents. She just held it, one corner pinched between her fingers, and set it down again as if weighing its gravity. Her eyes never left Rick's. He shifted forward, bracing his forearms on the table, the gum now motionless between his teeth. "What?" he snapped. "You gonna look at me all day? Or you gonna pretend this isn't personal?" And still silence. Because Maya Rollins knew what Rick Lawton did not, that power didn't need to raise its voice to be heard, that authority didn't need to counter insult with indignation. It only required to exist, solid and unshaken, until the weight of one's bravado collapsed inward from lack of resistance. A courtroom is a battlefield with invisible weapons, and today, the only one drawing blood was silence. Rick's voice filled the void again, but this time the volume had slipped. "You got nothing," he said, though it sounded more like hope than fact. "You're just waiting for me to trip, trying to trap me with my own words." Maya's hands folded neatly in front of her. She blinked. The red of her robe didn't move with the wind. There was none. But the light caught it again, that same cruel sliver of luminescence that sliced down the sleeve like a brand, Rick noticed. His eyes flicked toward it, just a twitch, and back. He laughed again, but this time it was short, dry, defensive. "Fine," he said, throwing his hands up. "We're doing it this way. Stare me down, play the whole righteous queen act, just know something." He leaned in. "I've buried better people than you in this system. People with tenure, with pedigree. What makes you think you'll be any different?" Maya's expression didn't flinch, but she breathed in, once, as if collecting air for the first real strike. Then she spoke. Nothing more than a whisper, but in the void of that courtroom, it landed like steel on glass. "You're confusing arrogance with immunity." Rick blinked. The gum in his mouth stopped moving. Maya continued, voice low and measured, like a razor drawn slowly across a whetstone. "You've learned how to yell, how to intimidate, how to wear a badge like armor and use the silence of others as consent. But this room doesn't move to your tempo. It doesn't fear your resume. And it sure as hell doesn't respect your volume." She leaned forward, only slightly, but it was enough. The weight shift turned her silhouette into something immovable. "You want to perform," she said. "Perform. But just know, this isn't your stage." Rick opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, but no words came out. Because suddenly, for all his bravado, he'd run out of script. And for the first time, in a courtroom he'd thought he could bend to his image. Rick Lawton realized he wasn't the one being watched. He was the one being judged. Rick Lawton had run out of script, but not out of noise. Silence didn't suit him. It crawled over his skin like static. The weight of Maya's words still hovered in the air, heavy and unmoved. But Rick couldn't let it settle. He wouldn't. He stood up, too fast, too loud, the chair behind him screeching like a warning. His palm slammed the table with a sharp, echoing crack. "Is this a serious hearing?" he barked, venom curling under his voice, "or some public theater for affirmative action fanatics?" The walls didn't flinch, but the words hung like smoke from a gun just fired. His face twisted, grinning like a man who had nothing to lose and was damn proud of it. "Because if this is justice," he said, sweeping one hand dramatically across the room, "then we might as well sell popcorn at the door." Maya didn't blink. She didn't rise. She simply turned her head a few degrees and gave the court clerk a look. Nothing more than a flicker of intention, and the clerk began typing. Rick laughed. Loud. Mocking. spitting out each sound like it was a slap in the face of the entire judiciary. "Are you serious?" he scoffed, eyes narrowing. "We're documenting this? Really?" He stepped forward, not quite enough to breach protocol, but enough to assert his shape into the space. "Let me get this straight," he said, arms wide, voice dripping disdain. "A black woman under 40 gets a robe, a hammer, and suddenly I'm on trial? For what? Not clapping when the diversity parade passed by?" Maya's gavel tapped once, then again, then a third time. Each hit soft, deliberate, clean, like stones dropped into still water. Her voice followed with the same precision, no more than necessary. "You are entitled to lawful speech," she said, her tone smooth as marble, "but not to degrading this court." Her words landed not as a reprimand, but as law, final, non-negotiable. They cut through Rick's theatrics like cold steel, but he didn't retreat. No, he thrived in the mire of confrontation. "Oh, is that how it works now?" he sneered, his lips curling into something close to disgust. "You can wear that robe, sit on that high horse, and pretend we're equal in this room, but we both know I earned my place. I fought for it, bleed for it. You climbed a ladder built by pity and politics." His voice cracked with fury, but not from lack of control. He wanted the fury, invited it, used it like a torch in a dark tunnel. "You think that robe makes you righteous?" he said, inching forward. "It just makes you a puppet with better lighting." Maya didn't react. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even lower her gaze. Her eyes remained level, steady, unbroken. The table before her might as well have been a fortress. Her silence was not submission, it was strategy. And Rick, for all his noise, hadn't yet noticed he was losing ground with every syllable. Then he did it. The most primitive, most childish act in the book of defiance. He turned, leaned slightly, and spat. A thick, deliberate glob of saliva hit the courtroom floor with a slick, ugly sound. He smiled afterward, wide, triumphant, like he'd just proven something that couldn't be taken back. "This court," he said, voice low now, raw and sharp, "is lower than me." It was meant to sting, meant to shock, but Maya didn't recoil. She didn't respond with anger. Instead, she looked at him for one long, measured moment, then at the spot on the floor where his spit had landed. Her gaze returned to his face, slow and exacting as if marking coordinates. She didn't need to say what everyone already felt, that the act was base, that the man was unraveling. Her silence wasn't lack of reply, it was judgment. Rick, though, was high on his adrenaline. "Yeah," he muttered, stepping back, shoulders loose, voice a rasp. "That's right, I said it. You don't scare me, Rollins. You don't earn respect by playing dress-up and quoting rules. You earn it by walking through fire. I've walked through plenty. You just walked into this courtroom like it's your stage. But I've lived on battlefields you can't even imagine." What he didn't say, what echoed anyway, was that Maya had already burned through more in 30 seconds of silence than he had in a decade of shouting, because this wasn't about fire, it was about what survived it. Maya tapped the gavel once more, and again the sound was soft, measured, controlled. Her expression didn't shift, but the moment had. The temperature in the room was no longer determined by Rick's outbursts, but by the calm hand that controlled the tempo. She spoke, low and firm. "Your words are on record, so is your behavior. The court will proceed regardless of your posture." Rick sat back down, slower now, but he tried to maintain the sneer, tried to hold the mask in place even as the seams began to crack. "This whole damn place," he muttered under his breath, but loud enough to be caught, "is a joke." But nobody laughed. Not Maya, not the walls, not the silence, which now clung to him like a consequence he hadn't prepared for. And for all his noise, for all his posturing, Rick Lawton didn't realize yet, it wasn't the height of the judge's chair that made it powerful, it was the weight of restraint and the silence that followed. The silence after Rick's last jab didn't crash, it stretched, taut and thin, like the top string of a violin seconds before it snaps. Maya didn't lift her gaze. She didn't acknowledge his muttered insult nor the curl of sarcasm still etched on his lips. Instead, She reached with exacting grace for a single document from the thick case file in front of her. The courtroom's breath held. There was no ceremonial preamble, no drawn-out speech to formally declare the session open. Maya simply began, her voice steady, cool, untouched by the heat Rick threw into the air. "Proceeding number 4817 is now open," she said, her tone surgical. "The court recognizes the parties present." And then, without further ceremony, she turned her eyes to the document in her hand and began flipping pages. Slowly, deliberately, not skipping a single line. Rick scoffed. Louder this time. He leaned back in his chair with exaggerated laziness, arms crossed like a man watching amateur theater and fighting boredom. "Jesus," he muttered. "What is this? Did you borrow that robe from a Comic-Con booth?" His voice dripped with cruelty, but it wasn't just sarcasm. It was coated in contempt, laced with the kind of bile that only festers in men who've long mistaken domination for respect. He shifted forward again, never one to let silence win for too long. "I used to lead entry squads," he said with forced pride, pitching his voice so it filled the room. "Kicked down doors, disarmed meth heads at gunpoint. You think I'm gonna sit here and nod while some cosplay judge reads my grocery list?" Maya did not blink. Her hands turned the pages with unwavering rhythm, like a metronome set to a tempo no one else could hear. No twitch in her brow, no tension in her shoulders. Each movement is silent, precise, like the slow rotation of gears behind unbreakable glass. Rick shifted again, impatient. He wasn't used to being ignored, especially not by someone in power, especially not by someone who refused to be baited by volume. "What the hell are you doing?" he barked. "You reading a novel up there? Maybe you want a glass of wine, too?" He let the sarcasm stew, expecting a flicker of irritation, a twitch at the corner of her mouth, anything human. He got nothing. Maya continued reading, her gaze scanning the page with exact focus. She didn't look at him. He slammed his hand on the table again. "Hey! I asked you a question." Only then did she raise her eyes, slow and direct, the movement so subtle it felt seismic. She held his stare for a moment. Not long, not dramatic, just enough for the temperature to shift again. Then she answered, quiet and calm, with words that didn't just land, they dug. "I'm reviewing the ethical conduct report of a former officer with 12 official complaints over 10 years. She said, her voice as clear as a polished blade. "It's a lot to go through." The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was electric. Rick's mouth opened, then paused. For the first time since the hearing began, he hesitated. Just 1 second, but it was enough. Enough for the room to register the shift. Enough for Maya to see the flicker in his expression. That microsecond of impact, where words hit somewhere even Rick couldn't deny. He recovered quickly, masking the slip with a scoff and a scowl, but it was too late. The air had changed. The momentum had tilted. 12? He spat, voice louder now, trying to force back control. "Yeah, complaints from who? Drug dealers? Thugs who didn't like getting cuffed? That file doesn't mean anything." His voice cracked with an edge of desperation, disguised poorly as disdain. "People like you don't understand the street. You think every officer with a rough hand is some kind of villain? We don't get to sip lattes and hold seminars. We get shot at. We decide who walks and who doesn't. That file you're reading?" He pointed a finger, jabbing it toward her like a weapon. "It's written by people who never wore the badge." Maya didn't respond. She flipped another page. Rick laughed, but it was hollow now, the kind of laugh that echoes back off stone walls. Of course you're going to pretend that means something." He shook his head, chuckling as though trying to convince himself. "This whole court is just optics. You're here for the headline, put the white man on trial, make the news cycle happy." His words were bitter, acidic, each syllable a splash of poison meant to stain everything in reach. "Still," Maya read, and every page she turned felt like a layer peeling off of Rick's armor. Not torn, not ripped, just Rick leaned forward again, knuckles on the table, voice lowering into something tighter, darker. "You know what burns me?" he whispered. "That people like you, people who've never fought, never bled for this country, get to sit in that chair and judge me. You hide behind rules and titles. You wear that robe like it makes you holy. But I see you. I see the ambition, the agenda. You're not here for justice. You're here for revenge in disguise." Maya looked up again, slow and composed, and for the first time, she spoke without referencing the page in her hand. Her eyes didn't flicker. Her voice didn't rise. "You don't see me," she said. "You see what you need me to be, so you can excuse what you've become." Rick flinched. It was barely perceptible, but it was there. A clench at the jawline, a shift in his shoulder, the kind of reaction that comes when a hit lands in the soft spot. "You led raids," she continued, voice still calm, still razor-edged. "You used force. You made decisions in seconds that others would hesitate over for hours. And somewhere along the way, you decided that made you above consequence." Rick's fists clenched. He looked like he wanted to throw something, scream something, tear something apart. But he didn't, because suddenly the room wasn't bending to his rhythm anymore. It was bending to hers. Maya didn't need to shout. She didn't need to accuse. She simply stated facts like weather patterns, like gravity. Undeniable, constant, unafraid. And so she went back to the file, her fingers resuming their pace. Not fast, not slow, just relentless. Rick stared at her, and for the first time, he didn't know what to say. Not because he didn't have more venom, but because it no longer felt like enough. Because something in the room had shifted. And it wasn't just power. It was true. And Rick Lawton, for all his swagger, all his noise, had no defense against the truth. That didn't flinch. Rick stared at her, breathing heavily, words dying on the edge of his tongue. The courtroom was frozen in that brutal stillness that follows a punch not yet acknowledged. His jaw shifted. His hands, once so assured, now hovered uncertainly over the table, knuckles pale. The silence wasn't his anymore. It belonged entirely to her. Then Maya moved, not dramatically, not for show. She simply turned her wrist and glanced at the small, unremarkable watch that peeked out beneath the crimson sleeve of her robe. The gesture was quiet, almost forgettable. Except nothing Maya Rowlands did in that courtroom was ever unintentional. She looked back up, straight at Rick, and let the sentence fall without ceremony, without emphasis, and yet it carved through the air like a verdict being sharpened as it was spoken. "It's been 4 minutes," she said, "since your first insult against this court. I believe the appropriate moment has arrived." She reached her right. No flourish, no declaration. Just one movement, clean and deliberate, as her hand pulled forward a black folder embossed with a red federal seal. The emblem gleamed under the light, unyielding. She placed it on the bench in front of her like it was the final piece of a puzzle she'd been waiting to solve. Rick didn't move. She opened it slowly, her fingers turning the cover with the same clinical precision she had used for every page of his record. Inside, only a few sheets of paper, but the air thickened like smoke. Her voice remained low, calm, icy. "This is a formal initiation order for a professional conduct evaluation of Officer Rick Lawton," she said. "The petition is active, effective immediately, and will be overseen by me." The blow wasn't loud, but it was absolute. Rick didn't shout. He didn't scoff. For the first time, he simply froze. His mouth opened slightly, as if to protest, to question, but nothing came out. A beat passed, then another, and then finally, in a voice stripped of its usual venom and swagger, he asked, "Who the hell are you?" Maya paused. Not because she was unsure, but because timing was a weapon, and she was about to wield it with the precision of a scalpel. She set the folder down, closed it with a soft snap, and met his eyes. Her stare didn't burn, it dismantled. Calm, even, devastating. 7 years ago, she began, I was assigned to the Internal Ethics Committee for the Metro Police Department. At the time, I authored a recommendation to have you removed from active duty for repeated violations of conduct unbecoming of an officer. That document, she nodded toward the file, was buried. Rick's breath caught. The reaction was small, but it was real, and Maya pressed on. her voice never rising, never changing, because the truth didn't need volume to cut. Today, she continued, I no longer need to recommend. Today, I have the authority to sign. Rick stared at her like he'd just glimpsed the shadow behind the curtain, something he'd ignored for too long because it hadn't yet spoken. Now it was speaking, and it wore crimson and control. His tongue moved against his teeth. His mind, always so ready with a jab, a slur, a quip, found only silence. The man who roared had gone mute. The moment didn't erupt. It didn't explode. It sank, slowly, irrevocably, like a floor giving way beneath feet that had never before questioned their footing. And Rick, for all his bravado, didn't know how to fight that kind of fall. Rick blinked once, twice, and then the silence cracked, not with reason or defense, but with a laugh. It burst from his chest like a shot from a faulty gun, wild and out of place. Too loud for the room, and far too proud for the weight it failed to carry. He threw his head back and clapped his hands once, twice, like an audience member drunk at a bad comedy show, high on his version of the punchline. You think that chair scares me? He barked, pointing toward the judge's bench as if it were a prop in a children's play. You think that robe and your little folder full of bureaucratic bullshit are supposed to make me tremble? His voice rang sharp and theatrical, cutting across the space like broken glass, jagged and cruel. Lady, I've seen politics dressed up in law more times than I can count. This federal courthouse, a carnival. And you're just the latest ringmaster, waving a red flag like it means something. Maya didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her stillness wasn't passive, it was poised, a coil held tight, not for fear, but for force. Rick mistook it for hesitance, the same way he'd misread every calm voice in a storm. So he kept going, feeding the fire he'd built for himself. This is a joke, he said. Slower now, savoring the words like venom on his tongue. You're all about optics, aren't you? Drag the big bad white cop into court, hand the gavel to the pretty poster girl in crimson, make it a show. Hell, I'm surprised you didn't sell tickets. Still, she said nothing. Her hands rested gently at the edge of the bench, and the file sat untouched beside them like a loaded weapon nobody needed to brandish. Rick leaned forward, hands on the table, a smirk bleeding across his face. Let me guess, he sneered. This whole thing's been planned since the moment you saw my name. A little payback fantasy? You think you're going to take me down with paperwork and posture? That's when she moved. She stood, but it wasn't abrupt. It was deliberate, seamless, like a figure rising from still water. No rustle, no dramatic swish of fabric. She rose with the elegance of inevitability. Rick's mouth stopped moving, not out of fear, but out of confusion. This wasn't in the script. Judges didn't get off the bench, not like this. Not with that calm. Her steps were slow, calculated. Maya stepped down from her elevated platform, descending the short set of stairs with the kind of composure that made it feel like the floor rose to meet her. Each movement was fluid, her robe trailing like a flag that never had to wave to declare allegiance. She walked toward Rick, not fast, not looming, but steady. She covered the short distance in silence, stopping exactly 2 meters away. That was close enough for him to feel her presence in full, yet not close enough for him to invade it. And even as she stood on lower ground, the slight incline of the platform behind her kept her half a head above him. Rick straightened instinctively. His smile faltered for half a breath before returning in defense. What now? He said, voice roughened with the friction of uncertainty. You gonna lecture me face to face? Make sure the cameras catch the power move? But there were no cameras, no audience, only the two of them, trapped in that space where silence makes every heartbeat feel like a verdict. Then Maya spoke. Her voice was calm, almost quiet, but it carried. I'm not here to scare you, she said, the words clear and unhurried. And this bench doesn't give me power. The law does. Her eyes didn't blink, her hands didn't move. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to remind you that the law doesn't need to scream to be obeyed. The room didn't shift. The air didn't tremble, but something inside Rick did. He tried to laugh again. It came out smaller, weaker. Oh, come on, he said, voice cracking like glass under a boot. This whole thing's just a play, right? You and your folder and your carefully measured words? You think a guy like me is gonna fold because someone like you stands tall? Maya didn't look away. She didn't flinch or respond, and that was the answer. That she didn't need to prove her height. She was already higher than he, not by elevation, but by clarity, by control, by the one thing he never learned to wield without a weapon: authority. Rick's voice faltered. For the first time, it didn't land. It didn't echo. It just stopped. And her silence, again, was louder than his noise had ever been. Rick Lawton had always believed that history was something you outlived. That if you walked through enough fires, kicked down enough doors, and shouted loud enough for long enough, the past would eventually be drowned out by your present. But now, standing in a courtroom, colder than any crime scene he'd ever controlled, staring at a woman who moved with the precision of inevitability, he realized something he hadn't accounted for. The past doesn't burn. It packs itself up, waits in silence, and returns, fully armed. Maya Rawlins stood 2 meters from him, the light catching the red fold of her robe like a final stroke of a painter who knew exactly where to end the portrait. Her voice didn't rise, didn't shake. It cut. "Case file supplemental summary," she said, unflinching. 4 filed complaints selected for federal review. She didn't ask for silence. She didn't demand attention. She owned both. First, Jeremiah Cross, age 14, detained without cause, left with a broken radius, fractured in 2 places. Medical report confirmed. Blunt force trauma consistent with a baton strike. Rick sneered. Little thug had a switchblade. He spat. Should have been charged, not coddled. Maya ignored the outburst. Second, Evelyn Ramirez, detained for obstruction of justice, released without charges after 22 hours. Later, confirmed to be a witness, not a suspect, in a domestic abuse call where her neighbor was the actual victim. Rick scoffed. She was mouthy. Got in my way. You hesitate in the field, you go home in a bag. Maya continued. Third, Andre Fulton, shot in the leg while reaching for his identification during a stop. Refused first aid for 7 minutes. Body cam footage shows no threat posed at the time of the incident. Rick's voice cut through like broken metal. That bastard ran his mouth. Made a sudden move. You want a bullet count next time, or you want me alive? Then Maya stopped. She looked at him, finally, direct. Not with rage, not even with pity, just clinical acknowledgement. She spoke again, still calm. You want to justify pain because it makes your actions easier to wear, but this isn't your locker room. It's a courtroom. Rick slammed a fist against the table. They're trash. All of them. I kept the streets clean while suits like you were busy writing essays and playing dress-up with policy manuals. The room didn't echo with applause. There was no crowd to cheer the outburst, just wood and walls, and the unmistakable sound of control slipping. I maintained order, Rick barked. I kept chaos on a leash. Maya didn't blink. You may have kept a leash, she said, but you strangled more than you secured. Rick laughed. Too loud, too close to hysteria to be dismissed. Yeah? And what exactly are you going to do about it? Write another report? Take away my name on some spreadsheet? She turned her head slightly. Court officer? She said, not looking away. Her voice didn't change. It didn't rise. It just triggered motion. A bailiff entered, not in haste. Not with drama, just with duty. Maya kept speaking. Present the service weapon and badge of Officer Rick Lawton, effective immediately, promotion of ethical suspension, pending federal review. Rick blinked. You can't. He didn't answer. The officer approached. Rick took a step back. No, this is just theater. She doesn't have that authority. The badge, Maya said. The room held its breath. Rick pulled it off like it was skin, slowly, reluctantly, not because he feared the process, but because he suddenly realized what it meant to surrender something not taken by force, but by consequence. The badge landed on the table with a soft metallic click. The gun followed, heavy, unloaded, symbolic in its own right. Maya didn't gloat. She didn't move. She simply turned back toward the bench, red robe whispering against the tile. And in that silence, Rick Lawton, once the loudest man in any room, stood as a symbol without meaning, stripped, not by bullets, not by threats, but by a justice that didn't flinch. The sound of the badge hitting the table hadn't fully died before the next step came. There was no delay, no indulgence in drama. This wasn't a spectacle. It was the procedure, cold, unflinching, deliberate. Maya had already returned to her bench, her robe settling like a curtain falling after the final act of a one-man show that had gone on too long. Her gaze didn't linger on Rick. He was no longer the center, only a symbol now, reduced from figure to evidence. A court officer approached. "Mr. Lawton, you are to step aside until further instructions are given," the voice said, polite but sharp. Rick stood motionless for a second too long, his chest swelling not with air but resistance. He didn't move. He refused to. His fingers clenched the edge of the table like it could still anchor him in authority. "You don't move me," he muttered. "None of you do." But the grip he had wasn't strong enough to resist protocol. The officer motioned again. Rick jerked backward, pulling his shoulder out of reach, his voice rising like a dying flare. "Get your hands off me," he snapped. "I'm not under arrest. You've been removed from representation in this phase of the hearing," Maya stated calmly from the bench. "You are not under arrest. You are under review." Her tone was factual, not performative. It was not a declaration. It was classification. And in court, classification is reality. Rick took one last swing at control. "This is garbage," he growled, voice soaked in acid, a kangaroo court in federal clothing. He turned to the few shadows in the gallery, as if expecting allies to rise, to object, to echo his outrage. No one did. He was alone. Then Maya gave a nod, and the screen behind her lit up. Cool, clean, and clinical. No fanfare, no introduction. The audio began. The room hushed, not by command but by instinct, the way people quiet when they feel something dangerous approaching from behind. The voice that played was unmistakably Rick's, stronger than, cockier, unfiltered by the walls of judgment. The year was 2017. The setting, a closed-door training seminar for tactical officers. The topic, response strategy under duress. Rick's voice rang out through the room. "Listen, when you take down a black male, you make sure he's scared. I'm not talking cuffing him gently. I mean, make him understand who's in control. Fear is compliance." The silence afterward was surgical. The room didn't gasp. It froze. Not because the words were shocking. They were, but more than that, they were real. Documented, confirmed, no longer a rumor, no longer a whisper at the back of a precinct hallway. Rick had built an entire philosophy on intimidation, and now it stood exposed. He jumped to his feet. "That was internal," he shouted, voice unraveling. "That was not for the record. That wasn't supposed to be." Maya didn't move. "You are mistaken," she said. "What you say in training becomes doctrine. What becomes doctrine becomes a system. What becomes system becomes judgment." Rick's face contorted, his mouth trying to outrun the crumbling wall of deniability. "That was edited. Context matters. Maya didn't blink. "You are not just on trial," she said, each word distinct, weighty, final. "You are the case study in a new ethics curriculum being implemented across multiple enforcement agencies. Your conduct is no longer anecdotal. It is educational." He froze again. That line, he felt it, not as an insult, but as erasure. This was no longer about Rick Lawton, the man. This was about Rick Lawton, the mechanic, a gear in a machine gone rogue. And the system, at long last, was correcting its blueprint. He wasn't being sentenced, he was being defined. And there is nothing louder than being reduced to a warning label. Rick stood frozen, the last echo of Maya's words still thick in the air. His mind, once a hammer pounding every space with certainty, now scrambled to find footing, to reclaim the momentum he believed was his birthright. He scanned the room not with curiosity but with desperation. His eyes darted past the bench, past the files, past the shadows of consequence, and settled on the uniforms seated along the side wall. Blue fabric, polished badges, the very image of the fraternity he'd once commanded without question. He looked at them like a drowning man scans the surface for something solid, something familiar. "You," he said, voice cracking with something far too close to need, pointing at a row of officers as if their loyalty could still be summoned with a gesture. "You know me. You know what I've done out there. This is garbage. This is politics dressed up like justice." No one moved. He stepped forward, slightly unbalanced, the floor beneath him no longer echoing strength, but the brittle percussion of doubt. "Speak up," he snapped, louder now. Tell him I train half of you. Tell him how many of you wouldn't be standing here if I hadn't taken that risk, pulled that trigger, made that call." The silence that greeted him wasn't empty. It was damning. Each second stretched across the space like a curtain, falling on the act he refused to end. He turned again, eyes narrowing, searching for a crack in the wall of quiet resolve. Then he saw him. Third seat from the aisle, younger than most, clean-shaven, jaw tight, uniform crisp, like someone still trying to prove something. Rick knew him instantly. Keller, Patrol Academy, class of 2019, one of his own. He'd taken the kid under his wing, showed him how to bend rules that didn't bend fast enough. Rick had once told Keller, point blank, "Out there, hesitation kills. If you're not making someone afraid, you're not in control." Rick stepped toward him, smile forced, fingers twitching as if holding on to an invisible past. "Keller," he said, voice rich with calculated familiarity, "tell him about that night in Oak Ridge. Remember? 2 suspects, 1 gun between them. I covered your ass and you know it. You owe me." Keller didn't look up. His eyes stayed on the floor, his hands gripped around the folder in his lap like it was the only thing anchoring him in place. The muscles in his jaw twitched, not with anger, but restraint. Rick's voice snapped, jagged and full of flame. "You owe me a goddamn life!" No response, no movement, no loyalty. Just one man, one lowered head, one refusal to participate in the mythology of a fallen idol. Maya, still seated, her gavel untouched, her hands folded, let her voice float through the room with the grace of a final breath. "No one owes you when the law has been twisted," she said, her tone as light as smoke and twice as hard to argue with. "There's no debt where power was used as currency." Rick spun, unhinged, his arm flung wide in the air, aiming for something to strike. Any object, any face, any memory that might obey. But nothing did. His foot caught the leg of his chair. The stumble was small, barely noticeable, but the symbolism landed heavy. He fell, not dramatically, not in pain, but into the hollow shape of the authority he once wore like armor. There was no one rushing to lift him. No hand reached out. He was not under attack. He simply collapsed into the vacuum he had created for himself. And in that moment, it became painfully clear Rick Lawton was not just alone. He had been abandoned, silently, permanently, by the very hands that once saluted him. Rick didn't stand, he didn't speak, he didn't scream. For the first time in the room that had once bent around the force of his voice, there was nothing, not from him. The silence wasn't fear, it was recognition. Cold, creeping, and merciless. The silence that falls when a man sees the collapse not of a system, but of his illusion, of being untouchable within it. He had thundered into this courtroom like a storm, convinced he would bend it to his will, but now he sat still as stone, while the gavel of consequence struck without needing sound. Maya sat without motion, yet everything in the room moved to her rhythm. She didn't rise, didn't gesture, didn't need to. She reached for a small remote at the edge of her bench, and with a press of her thumb, the screen behind her came alive. No preamble, no performance, just a screen. Black at first, then white letters appearing slowly, deliberately, like a slow drumbeat beginning a funeral march. March 2012. Use of excessive force. Internal warning issued. A name followed. A grainy ID photo. A redacted report, its black bars unable to obscure the truth for anyone willing to see. The silence held. Rick's mouth remained set, but a tick twitched at the side of his jaw. He didn't blink, not yet. But the weight of the year, the report, the line of truth resurfacing, bore down on him with an old, familiar ache he thought he'd buried deep. Maya pressed again. August 2015. Unlawful detainment. Civilian complaint sustained. A second name. Another photo. This one a woman's face, bruised under poor courtroom lighting. Rick's hand curled slightly on the edge of the table. His grip wasn't for intimidation anymore. It was for control. Personal, private, useless. Again. November 2018. Obstruction of medical assistance. Disciplinary review deferred. The image that followed wasn't grainy. It was clean, clear, sterile. A man lying handcuffed, blood at his side, EMTs waiting just feet away, unmoving until someone, the officer in charge, gave permission. The video paused with a timestamp and the name Officer R. Lawton in the upper right corner. Rick's eyes dropped. Not because of guilt, not yet, but because something inside him finally understood. This was no longer about accusation. It was documentation. Maya turned slightly, not to look at Rick, but to address the room. Her voice remained steady, level, and unemotional. 3 cases, 3 years, 3 moments buried in policy, internal reviews, and administrative purgatory. They were quieted, deferred, refiled under protocol. She turned her gaze toward Rick now, not with anger or satisfaction, but with the authority of someone who had waited long enough. I filed the first recommendation for your removal from duty in 2016, she said. Tone flat, factual. It was ignored, shelved. Not due to lack of evidence, but lack of appetite. Rick clenched his jaw tighter. Maya didn't blink. Today, that appetite has changed. The screen behind Maya dimmed, but the images it had projected remained, etched not in pixels, but in the collective memory of everyone present. The air held the weight of them, not loud, but relentless, like smoke that didn't sting the eyes, yet made it impossible to breathe. Rick sat frozen, his knuckles white where they gripped the edge of the table. It wasn't a strength. It was a man holding on to the last inch of narrative before the floor gave way. He didn't deny the reports. Not now. Not when denial would have rung more hollow than silence. He didn't try to twist them into misunderstandings nor bark out legal jargon. That part of him, the defender, the performer, the wolf in uniform, had gone quiet, not by choice but by erosion. What was left was something closer to a man than he had allowed himself to be in years, but even now that man didn't apologize. He just waited, teeth grinding, eyes on the bench like he could will it to melt. Maya leaned forward slightly, folding her hands. No emphasis, no cruelty. Her voice was softer now, not because she offered comfort, but because the truth didn't need volume when it carried weight. You built your defense around volume, around the idea that if you spoke first and loudest, no one would hear the echoes of what came after you. But echoes don't fade when they're carved into record. Rick shifted in his seat, just enough to break the illusion of stillness. His mouth opened as if to say something, anything, but it closed again without sound. The man who once weaponized every syllable now found himself drowning in words that weren't his. The screen behind Maya flickered to one final entry. No heading, just a file code and a timestamp. Internal report, 18F72, RL/authored, Rollins M/. Date October 2016. The content didn't appear, just the title. Preliminary recommendation for termination of Officer Rick Lawton. Rick inhaled sharply, a sound barely audible, but the first voluntary noise from him in minutes. His eyes locked on the screen, and for a moment the rage returned, not to lash out, but to understand. His voice came low, scraped raw from within. "You wrote that?" he asked, not accusing, not threatening, just trying to pull the weight of her voice through the cracks in his understanding. Maya didn't hesitate. "Yes, you knew," he said, quieter now. "All this time, you knew this would come back." Her reply came like a judge's signature, measured, final. "No," she said. I didn't know. I hoped it wouldn't have to." Rick's next words weren't defiant. They were hollow, like a shell of protest from someone too tired to reload. "Why "Didn't you warn me?" And that's when Maya delivered the line that would linger long after the courtroom emptied, after the lights dimmed, after names were erased and positions dissolved. "Justice," she said, her tone cold enough to still a room, "doesn't send invitations." Rick didn't respond, not with words, not with fists. He sat as if the bench itself had spoken directly to his core and cracked it wide open. For a man whose legacy was built on noise, silence had become his undoing. He was no longer resisting, it was something else now. Something darker and more unfamiliar, reckoning. There were no handcuffs on his wrists, but the weight pressing down on his shoulders might as well have been iron. The room was still. Not the tense stillness that waits for eruption, but the reverent kind that settles in churches when something sacred or shameful has been revealed. The gallery no longer looked at Rick like a defendant. They looked at him like a warning label, peeled off a rusted bottle, held up in the light. Maya allowed the silence to stretch, not as punishment, but as a condition, a necessary void where understanding would either land or pass him by forever. She didn't speak again immediately. She didn't need to. The moment had its pulse, its rhythm, and it beat with the slow certainty of irreversible consequence. When she did speak, her tone remained the same, steady, plain, legal. "The pattern of behavior we've witnessed is not incidental," she said. "It is not circumstantial. It is systemic, perpetrated, protected, prolonged." She lifted her eyes to meet his, no contempt in them, just clarity. "And today, it ends." Rick looked away, not down, not in shame, but sideways, as though trying to find a crack in the wall, an exit that no longer existed. He licked his lips, blinked once, and whispered, "You could have just come to me." The irony of it made the room colder. Maya responded, barely above a breath. "You were never willing to listen without a badge between us?" That hit harder than any sanction. It was the truth, spoken not from judgment, but from history. Rick had built a fortress out of his badge, his rank, and his noise. And now, stripped of all three, he had nothing left but a seat and a history with nowhere to hide. The file closed behind her with a soft click, and Maya's hands folded one over the other, resting on the wood-like bookends on a final chapter. She made no gesture to dramatize it, no announcement, just a final line to seal the record. "We don't need your testimony," she said. "The system has already heard you for 10 years. Today, it answers back." Rick didn't reply. Not because he had nothing to say, but because every word he could reach for had already been weaponized, already used, already spent, and none of them could save him now. His tongue, once so quick to tear down, to defend, to distort, felt swollen, irrelevant. He was a man disarmed, not of tools or titles, but of narrative, of the very mythology he had written for himself brick by brick, complaint by complaint, silence by silence. Maya didn't move. She didn't turn her face toward victory or relief, because there was nothing victorious about this. This was justice, not vengeance. This wasn't a reckoning wrapped in fire. It was a ledger, balanced. The final number, Rick Lawton, no longer an officer, no longer untouchable, no longer loud. The courtroom, still full of people, felt impossibly quiet, and yet every mind echoed with the same truth. They weren't witnessing a man being judged. They were witnessing what happened when judgment arrived long after it was due. And when it arrived, it wasn't brutal, it was cold, measured, bureaucratic, inarguable. That was the real punishment, not the loss of status or the exposure of guilt, but how it unfolded, without passion, without hatred, just the truth, placed on record, never to be erased. Rick's body shifted slightly, like the weight of sitting upright had grown too much. His fingers flexed once, twice. A man feels the space around him collapse, molecule by molecule, and finally his voice returned, not to scream, not to beg, but to breathe the last line of resistance he had left. "So what happens now?" It came out small, hollow, not because he wanted an answer, but because men like him were wired to ask, even when the outcome was sealed. Maya didn't look at him. She stared forward, her eyes focused beyond the bench, as if addressing not just the room but the world beyond it. Her answer was simple, final, already written. "Now," she said, "you live with what you've done." And with that, the screen went dark. The record stood. The verdict wasn't spoken because it didn't need to be. It had already been lived. He didn't struggle, didn't lash out, didn't argue. Rick Lawton walked out of the courtroom flanked by protocol, not cuffs, not guards, not even condemnation, just the heavy silence of a man escorted by his undoing. Every step he took echoed not across marble, but within memory, like a weight dragging behind him that no one else could see but that everyone in the room felt. He walked straight, head not bowed, but somehow lower than before, as if gravity had finally remembered him. No cameras were waiting in the hall, no angry protesters, no former colleagues huddled in support or disgust. There was just a hallway, just cold light, just silence, the kind of silence that comes not from absence, but from choice. He didn't look back. There was nothing behind him worth claiming. Inside the courtroom, Maya Rollins remained seated, still. Absolute. Her hands reached forward with the same precision she had wielded since the moment she took the bench. She closed the file in front of her with a soft finality, not slamming, not snapping, just enough force to say, "This is complete." She didn't speak. She didn't rise. She reached for a pen, flipped the folder cover, and wrote a single line across the thick black surface, in clean, firm handwriting. Not a trial, a statement. There was no flourish. No signature. The words didn't need one. They weren't meant for history books or press releases. They were for the record, the real one, the quiet one, the one that sits in a drawer until someone asks why no one stopped it sooner. Rick stepped out into the daylight. The sky didn't darken. No storm rose. But the air had shifted, subtle, thin, stripped of that false authority that once followed him like a shadow. His shoes scuffed the pavement. His badge was gone. His weapon is gone. His name, once barked with command, now passed unspoken by strangers who walked by without pause. No one filmed him. No one yelled. No one stopped to ask what had happened. And that, perhaps, was the deepest cut, because the world didn't stop turning for him. It simply moved on without him. No handcuffs, no headlines, no hero's fall. Just a man stepping out of a federal courthouse with nothing in his hands but the absence of power, and not even a name that mattered anymore. Not one glance followed him, not one whisper clung to his back. The silence that once fueled his rage now swallowed him whole. Behind him, Maya remained unseen, untouched, unmoved. She didn't look out the window to watch him go. She didn't follow the end. Because for her, this was not an ending. It was the closure of one circuit, the ignition of another. The bench no longer carried his shadow, and the folder, marked with a single sentence, sat where it needed to sit, silent, permanent, unforgiving. Justice didn't need applause. It just needed to hold. And now, for the first time in over a decade, it did. The echo of his footsteps had barely faded when Maya closed the office door behind her. She didn't collapse into the chair. She sat like someone who had never been taught the luxury of rest, only pauses between obligations. The air was still, not heavy, not mournful, just exact. Outside her window, the city stretched like a machine that hadn't yet noticed a single cog had been pulled from its system. And inside, she pulled open a drawer with the calm of someone excavating time itself. The folder wasn't thick. It didn't need to be. Its weight wasn't in volume, but in timing. It was marked in faded ink. Law and R, Internal Memo, 2016. The tab had curled at the edge. The spine had flattened from being stacked, ignored, and filed beneath paperwork with shinier consequences. Maya held it like evidence, not against Rick, not anymore, but against something bigger, something older, something that had protected him, buffered him, fed him. She placed the file on the desk, opened it. Her hands moved slowly, not with hesitation, but with precision. She didn't reread the report for context. She knew every line. Every incident, every complaint had been whittled down to a footnote, but still she scanned it, because this time It wasn't for submission, it was for memory. And memory, in this office, was not sentimental, it was ammunition. Her signature stared back at her from the bottom of page 178. 7 years faded, but intact. The line above it: preliminary recommendation for dismissal, Officer Rick Lawton, due to repeated ethical violations demonstrating consistent disregard for boundaries between lawful enforcement and systemic abuse of authority. And below, the note she'd scrawled in the margin during her final draft, the sentence that had cost her 2 months of silence from department heads and 1 unofficial transfer offer. This man does not distinguish between power and humiliation. The ink had bled a little. Still legible, still true. She picked up her pen again. Same hand, same ink color, but this time no footnote, no margin. She turned to the final page, where the memo ended in an official recommendation that was never actioned, and just below the untouched line reserved for reassessment review, she wrote, "Reopened. Authority confirmed. Action proceeding." Then she signed her name, not as a suggestion, not as a whistle in the dark, but as a person who now had more than a voice. She had jurisdiction. This wasn't a vendetta, it was an overdue correction. The pen made no noise as it left the paper, but the silence that followed cracked like a verdict. Maya didn't linger over the signature. She didn't need to. The act was not sentimental, it was bureaucratic, surgical, meant to be permanent, not poetic. Her name had lived on the bottom of that report once before, powerless beneath the red tape of senior brass and backroom politics. But this time it wasn't a suggestion at the end of a long complaint. It was a sentence. She leaned back in her chair just slightly, the tension not leaving her body but shifting its weight. Behind her, a filing cabinet still bore the labels of cases that were never opened again, cases she knew by heart, some buried before they had a chance to scream. She reached for a second drawer, slower now, methodically. From the back, beneath a stack of budget reviews and departmental evaluations, she pulled out a thin manila envelope marked in her handwriting, "Confidential, eyes only." Inside was a printed copy of the email thread from 2016, the correspondence that followed her initial report. 4 replies from 4 supervisors, no longer than 5 lines. Phrases like, "handled informally, review unnecessary, and recommend shelving until cycle turnover." She read them again, not to refresh her memory but to renew her resolve. The ink hadn't faded. The cowardice hadn't either. She laid the printouts flat, one by one, like tombstone. Then, without a word, she picked up her phone and called her assistant. "I'll need access to the Ethics Council Registry Archive," she said. "Full clearance. Every name that voted against disciplinary action on Internal Memo 2016, LW." Her voice was calm, not cold. There was no anger in it, just order. Because this wasn't about punishing Rick anymore. This was about the hands that held him up, the structure that refused to bend when it should have broken, and if no one was going to name them, she would. "Also," she added, "bring me the 2016 meeting minutes. Not the edited ones, I want the draft log, the raw notes." She hung up without waiting for confirmation. She didn't need reassurance. She needed paper, proof, pattern, process. Maya didn't come to war with noise. She came with record-keeping. Outside, the sun dropped lower behind the skyline. The city didn't notice that one of its walls had begun to shift, but somewhere in a drawer, a pen stroke that had once been ignored was now a signal, and Maya Rawlins wasn't just a judge anymore. She was precedent in motion. She didn't leave the office for hours, not because of duty, but because the air inside was honest. Unlike courtrooms filled with rehearsed outrage and practiced silence, here the walls didn't lie. They held no audience, no witnesses, just facts. Just pages that remembered what people tried to forget. The assistant returned with a flash drive and a thin stack of papers. Maya nodded. She plugged the drive into her terminal, bypassed her standard user login with the override clearance she'd earned in the years since her last warning had been ignored. The archive unrolled before her like a suppressed memory, timestamps, anonymized comments, partial transcripts from internal voting sessions, all meticulously recorded yet never released. She scrolled past names she recognized. Supervisors have now retired, transferred, or silently promoted. She clicked on one file, marked Internal Review, Ethics Memo, not for external audit. And there it was, the discussion behind closed doors, sanitized in the official minutes, but captured raw here. Too aggressive. We can't afford a scandal right now. Rollins seems personal about this. Let it cool. Give Lawton a lateral transfer. We'll watch him. Watch him. She stared at those two words until her vision blurred. Then, quietly, she printed the document. She didn't slam her hand down. She didn't pace. She simply waited as the machine delivered the receipts. At the bottom of the final page was the line she had expected, but seeing it still felt like uncovering rot beneath marble. Case marked as addressed. Rollins notified. File, archive. The file wasn't addressed, it was buried, and she had been notified the way you notify someone they are no longer welcome in their fight. She placed the papers beside her earlier report. The ink might have dried, the signatures might have faded, but this time the paper wasn't evidence, it was leverage. With a pen in hand and silence on her side, Maya reached for a fresh folder. On the tab she wrote, Reinstated Dockets, W/LW16, Oversight Failure Audit. Then she added a post-it note to the front. No emotion, no flourish, just the truth. Original report suppressed without grounds. Escalation required. Prepared for federal review. She leaned back, closed her eyes for a second, and for the first time in hours, she exhaled. This wasn't revenge. It was record-keeping, done right. 7 years too late, but still on time for justice. She stayed in the building long after most of the lights had gone dark. Her windows still glowed like a signal flare. Quiet, unwavering, deliberate. Maya flipped through the newly printed report one last time, scanning for precision, not prose. Each line had to be irrefutable. No rhetoric, no moralizing, just a structured consequence. What they had dismissed as too aggressive in 2016 was now too late to ignore. She opened her laptop and began compiling the digital dossier. Attachments loaded, her original 2016 memo, the buried vote logs, the Ethics Council's soft denials, and the paper trail of suppression. She indexed each entry by date, impact, and departmental failure. Then, without emotion, she labeled the final document. Federal Submission, Case Study in Systemic Ethical Negligence. Subject, Officer Rick Lawton. Before sending it, she added one final note in the remarks field. This is not a correction. This is an archive, restored to integrity. She clicked Send. The server hummed. The system processed. And the file, 7 years overdue, finally moved. Outside, the city breathed in its usual apathy. But deep inside the servers of Federal Ethics Review, a dormant ghost had just been woken, and it carried dates, names, and proof that someone had tried to cauterize justice with silence. Maya stood, stretched her spine, and moved to the cabinet one last time. She locked the drawer that had once kept the Lawton file buried. Then she placed a red label across its front, unsealed. This wasn't noise. It was the consequence. Measured, cold, quiet, but irreversible. As she stepped into the hallway, her heels echoed alone. No applause waited. No audience witnessed. But somewhere down that silent corridor, the system was already shifting, because one page, when signed by the right hand, could weigh more than a gavel, and for the first time, it had. The email was dated July 8, 2016. Maya recognized the header format even before the body loaded. She had seen enough internal messages during her time to know when a system didn't clean up after itself, it just painted over the mold. The IT department had delivered quietly, discreetly, and without interpretation. That's all she asked. She didn't need context. She had lived in the 6 recovered files, all tagged with Rick Lawton's internal ID, all marked deleted, not backed up. But the system, as always, had loopholes, and the raw backup cache remembered what the surface tried to forget. She printed each file on thick white paper, no annotations yet, no highlights, just words, unaltered and final. The ink dried fast, but the words still carried heat. She laid them out in chronological order, watching the evolution of tone, of threat, of delusion. The first email was short, a simple line to a colleague in the precinct. She's asking questions, let her. We've buried bigger. The second came 2 days later. They always send one of those types when they want to play cleanup, one of those types. The language wasn't coded. It was casual, lazy, honest. By the fourth email, Rick was no longer dismissive, he was agitated. The subject line read, Rollins again. Rick wasn't. The choice to use it was pure theater. He had pulled it from some arrest report or overheard it during a raid and thought it sounded hard. That's what made it damning, not the racism, the performance. Maya didn't react outwardly. She didn't need to. Her face didn't change, but her eyes stopped blinking as she read the fifth file. This one was personal, not forwarded, not part of a chain, just Rick writing to another officer. Time-stamped 1:03 AMA, clearly sent in anger. If that bitch gets on that bench, I'll be the first one to pull her off it. No metaphors, no euphemisms. A threat posed not in heat, but in confidence. Rick hadn't imagined he'd ever be on the receiving end of Maya's decisions. To him, she had always been an obstacle, someone he could outlast, outsnarl, outrank. But now the words sat in print, stark and irreversible, like graffiti on the side of a courthouse. Maya reached for a red pen, not because it was dramatic, but because it contrasted. She underlined the final sentence of the last email with one firm stroke. If she gets the seat, I'll be the first to drag her off it. She circled it. Let the red ink bleed slightly into the next line. Then, Maya did something she hadn't done since the day she was sworn in. She smiled. Not wide, not smug, just a quiet, subtle curve of the mouth, like punctuation. The room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning, the steady rhythm of controlled air brushing against the blinds. Maya stood with the printed pages spread out before her, the red ink still drying under the sterile light above. She didn't move quickly. She moved deliberately, with the precision of someone who had long stopped hoping the truth would speak for itself. It needed context, it needed curation, and above all, it needed to be placed where it could not be ignored. She reached for a thin black binder marked Case Reopen, Internal Ethics. Inside it, she placed the 6 pages in order, sealing them within protective sleeves. Each one was a weapon, not because of the language, but because they had been buried. Exhumed truth always cuts deeper than a fresh wound. Her fingers paused briefly over the fourth email, the one where Rick had dropped the pretense. That line again. If that bitch gets on that bench, felt less like a threat now and more like prophecy denied. Maya didn't feel satisfied. That wasn't her fuel. It was affirmation, like snapping in the final piece of a puzzle everyone else had called incomplete. The door creaked slightly behind her, but she didn't turn. It was her assistant, eyes scanning the quiet layout of the office, then the tight formation of pages on the desk. "These are the files?" he asked, careful not to step too close. Maya nodded once. Recovered, verified, unredacted. She handed him the binder. "Scan them, upload them to the Federal Archive, full transparency tag, no holdbacks." He hesitated. "Even the threats, especially the threats?" Maya said, her voice flat, unwavering. "We don't edit history, we record it." He took the binder and left, not asking more. Maya remained still. Outside her window, the city had begun to shift into its afternoon rhythm. Sirens at a distance, sunlight cutting across glass. She turned toward her computer once again, now prepping a summary note to accompany the files. The subject line was simple: Lawton Communications, context for federal review. Then came the final sentence of the summary, short, direct. Let the system read what it tried to erase. Hours later, the files were no longer just papers on a desk. They were digital records, formally submitted into the Federal Ethics Database with full chain of custody documentation. No encryption keys, no password locks. Anyone with clearance could see them. That was the point. Maya didn't want them buried again, not under bureaucracy, not behind a wall of procedural reviews. Let the rawness breathe. Let the shame be seen. She sat back in her chair, eyes narrowing at the screen as the upload confirmed. It wasn't vindication she felt. It was the strategy. For every threat Rick had typed in the shadows, she had built a countermeasure in daylight, not with noise, with records, with the process. And now, those words, once whispered behind firewalls and badge access, were part of the permanent federal archive, indexed under Code of Conduct violations, exemplary case material. Her phone buzzed once, an encrypted message. IT, request fulfilled. No anomalies in metadata. Files distributed to Ethics Board, DOJ Liaison, and Internal Oversight. She typed back, acknowledged. Outside her office, conversations resumed in muffled tones. Shoes clicked against the floor, and a printer hissed somewhere down the hall. Life in the building moved on, as if nothing seismic had just been put into motion. But Maya knew the gravity. This wasn't courtroom drama. This was systemic exposure. On her desk was a framed quote, etched into a strip of steel rather than paper. Truth isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. She had chosen it years ago, long before this case, long before she knew a man named Rick Lawton would throw every inch of his arrogance into the fire, assuming he'd never get burned. But truth didn't forget. It waited. By the time the clock in her office ticked past midnight, Maya was still seated, reviewing annotations, timestamps, and internal response memos. The fluorescent lights cast no shadow. She had learned long ago not to rely on daylight to mark progress. True accountability worked in artificial light, in the hours when no one clapped and no one watched. The final task was symbolic. She retrieved a hard copy of the ethics manual, the very edition Rick had once trained under. Inside the back cover, she slid a printed version of his own words, the unfiltered email, the line he thought had been lost forever, folded neatly, one line highlighted in the same red she'd used earlier. I'll be the first to pull her off that bench. She didn't tape it, didn't staple it, just let it rest there, silent but irremovable, like a shadow that belonged. She returned the book to the training archive in the judicial wing, logged the deposit, and marked the note. Reference material, permanent educational use, no ceremony, no victory dance, just processed, sealed, and cataloged. As she left the archive room, her footsteps echoed down the marble corridor. She didn't look back. There was no need to. The door shut behind her with a click, not dramatic, not symbolic, just final. Rick's threats were no longer noise. They were evidence. They were instructed. They were history. And most importantly, they could never again be erased. The silence inside the ethics hearing chamber wasn't the kind that asked for quiet. It was the kind that demanded it. The walls were a clinical white, bright enough to reflect every thought that tried to hide. The table in the center was rectangular, not round, not symbolic. It didn't invite dialogue. It dictated order. Rick Lawton walked into that room like a ghost who hadn't realized he was dead. The clack of his shoes against the polished floor had no echo. That room didn't return your sound unless it had reason to. He scanned the walls, once familiar, now foreign. He had taught here. For nearly a decade, he had stood precisely where the lead interrogator now sat. The irony didn't announce itself. It wrapped around his throat like a cord, waiting for a verdict. Rick adjusted his collar, less out of discomfort and more because it was the last piece of the presentation he had left. No badge, no gun, no rank, just fabric and friction. Across from him, Maya Rollins sat with her back straight. A single pen poised above a legal pad she hadn't written on yet. She didn't need to. Everything worth saying was already said, by Rick, in the past, in his own words. Her silence now wasn't anticipation, it was the arrangement. Rick's name had been read into the record, followed by the charges. Misconduct, ethical violations, obstruction, and abuse of authority. He had no counsel present. He had declined. Or maybe no one wanted the job. It was hard to defend someone when the archive did all the cross-examining for you. When Maya finally spoke, Her voice didn't rise, it landed. "Do you remember your favorite line during your tactical behavior lectures?" she asked. Her tone didn't accuse. It clarified. Rick blanked. His lips parted, but the air didn't come. Then she spoke again, quoting him word for word with none of the bravado he used when he said it the first time. "Make them scared first, then talk." There was no reaction from the board. They didn't need one. That phrase was etched into the audio log Maya had submitted just days prior. Rick had laughed when he said it back then. Now the silence devoured the echo of his laugh before it could reach the walls. She leaned forward, not closer, just enough. "Today, no one is scared of you, so talk." Rick opened his mouth. The words he had once weaponized were now shackled by their weight. For the first time, language failed him. He wasn't being asked to speak for others. He was being told to account for himself. And the room he once commanded had turned into a confessional he couldn't negotiate his way out of. Rick's fingers twitched slightly on the surface of the table. They wanted to grasp something: papers, a badge, a firearm, even a lie. But there was nothing, no props left in this theater. He cleared his throat, an involuntary act meant to claim control. "That quote, it was taken out of context," he finally muttered, but the sentence barely made it to the end of the table. No one nodded, no one reacted. It didn't deserve a reaction. Maya didn't flinch. "Explain the context," she said. Simple, brutal. There was no curve in her tone, no accusation, only the scalpel of command. Rick inhaled, long and shallow. "I was teaching how to manage threat escalation," he said. "It was part of a case study which wasn't authorized by curriculum standards." Maya cut in, not loudly, just sharply. "Nor reviewed by any oversight body, nor included in your submitted training plans." She paused for effect, but the silence was already heavier than any voice could compete with. "It was your context, built by you, deployed by you, and repeated." He clenched his jaw. "That's how the street works. You wouldn't know. And that's how men like you justify every breach of law as instinct," Maya replied, her voice now settling like dust after a demolition. "But instinct isn't policy. Fear isn't a protocol. And what you taught wasn't survival. It was supremacy." Rick leaned back slightly, not in defiance, but as if the room was slowly pressing in. The lights didn't dim, but they felt colder. The chairs didn't shift, but they felt more distant. His world was still, but shrinking. One of the board members, silent until now, spoke. "We have no further questions for Judge Rollins at this time. We'll recess for 30 minutes to review her submitted dossier." Rick didn't look at Maya. He looked down, where the table's reflection caught part of his face. The same face that had grinned through interviews, laughed through interrogations, and scowled through disciplinary reviews now looked unfamiliar. Not older, not broken, just irrelevant. Maya stood. She gathered her notes, untouched except for one corner marked by her thumbnail, and walked out without a glance back. Power didn't need to stare to know it had the room. Rick remained seated, still breathing, still stubborn, but for the first time in a room he used to rule, Rick Lawton had nothing left to teach. Rick leaned forward in his chair, his tone sharpened to a clinical precision that masked the panic creeping up his throat. "I acted by protocol," he said. "The body cam was down. The security feed was flagged as non-operational that day. There was no viable footage." His voice sounded rehearsed, not because he had prepared it, but because he had said variations of it for years. Like muscle memory molded around absence, it always fit until now. Maya Rollins didn't blink. She didn't rebut. She simply reached into her briefcase, withdrew a sealed envelope marked with the emblem of the Federal Oversight Division, and slid it across the table without a word. The board chair looked at her, then at Rick, then broke the seal. Inside were 2 items: a signed affidavit from the internal technical audit team confirming full operational status of the surveillance system, and a flash drive labeled Hallway 3C, March 19, 2:46 p.m. And the room didn't shift, it dropped. One of the assistants connected the drive to the overhead screen. The playback began without sound, but the silence was more deafening than any audio could have managed. The footage was crystal clear. time-tapped, verified, and untampered. It showed Rick storming through the hallway, uniform creased and temper primed. Maya had just exited the courtroom, calm, composed, unaware of the oncoming storm. Rick closed the distance like a fuse chasing its explosion. He stopped a foot from her, jabbed a finger an inch from her face, then, without hesitation, cocked his arm back and drove his fist toward her. She didn't flinch. His fist never landed. It hovered for a second in the air, like an unfinished sentence too crude to speak, then dropped. But the venom had already spilled from his mouth. "Get off that damn bench, you brown-skinned bitch." The room didn't gasp. It inhaled and forgot how to exhale. The tape froze at that precise moment. Rick mid-mouth, mouth open, venom suspended, a frame locked in forever. Maya didn't turn to face the screen. She kept her eyes on the wall, expression unreadable. She didn't need to look at the footage. She had already lived it. The room, however, had never seen it before. Not like this. Not without deniability. Rick shifted in his seat. That was an emotional moment. It didn't... Annabeth, you said there was no video. One board member cut him off. Voice neutral but spine straightened. "That's a lie, under oath." "I assumed." "No," Maya said. Her voice was steel wrapped in velvet, quiet but cutting through the air like a blade. "You counted on silence. You didn't assume. You deleted." Rick opened his mouth again, but the weight of the moment was no longer negotiable. The board wasn't listening for excuses. They were watching a record. Indisputable, undeniable, unspinnable. Maya stood slowly, her movements as deliberate as the lines of a verdict. "You didn't raise your fist to silence me. You raised it because silence wasn't enough. You needed to erase me." She looked at no one in particular, eyes fixed on the middle distance, voice like judgment passed down through generations. But here's the thing about cameras, Rick. They don't blink. They don't forget. And they never, ever flinch. The board didn't ask for a vote. They didn't need to. The footage had spoken, louder than Rick ever had, clearer than any report Maya had filed, and more damning than any witness testimony ever could be. When the screen went black, no one moved. Not Rick, not the board, not Maya. The silence wasn't awkward. It was sacred. It wasn't a pause. It was a sentence. Maya walked out, not triumphant, not vindicated, just finished. Her hands didn't shake, her steps didn't waver, because real power doesn't scream. It shows up in silence and leaves truth playing on a screen no one can turn off. The echo of the video still rang in the walls long after the screen went black, a ghost that neither time nor denial could shake off. Rick sat hollow-eyed, frozen in the seat that no longer belonged to someone with credentials. Maya didn't need to deliver a speech. She didn't need to lean in with sharpened retorts or triumphant warnings. Her power resided now in a signature, not a voice. And that was what made it irreversible. When she returned to her office, there were no lights dimmed for reflection. The fluorescence stayed bright, clinical, unflinching, like the truth she had just weaponized. She opened the personnel portal for federal enforcement records and typed in Rick Lawton's name. His profile opened with a defiant flash of titles. Tactical Lead 9019-929. Clearance Alpha Grade. But right beneath the surface, buried in layers of negligence, was the crack Maya had waited years to dig open. She had requested a full audit of Rick's certification files 3 weeks ago, quietly, methodically. Now the final report was in. It came stamped from the Office of Internal Qualifications Review, detailing that the tactical certificate submitted under Rick Lawton's file had been issued by a facility called Midwest Tactical Training Institute, a center that had lost its federal licensing due to multiple falsification violations. The certificate Rick submitted 12 years ago, issued 3 weeks after the center's license, had been revoked. No follow-up, no background check, and no re-evaluation had been conducted. He had walked into one of the most elite SWAT divisions in the country on a lie, and the system had nodded along. Maya didn't react. She didn't gasp. She simply reached for the document that had already been prepared in anticipation, a single-sheet order titled immediate, indefinite suspension and removal from Federal Enforcement Registry. No ceremony, no trial. Just a signature. She placed her initials under the clause. Subject permanently removed from all national enforcement systems and databases, with revocation of tactical credentials, effective retroactively to date of entry. Once her pen lifted from the page, the process moved at the speed digital networks had perfected. The form was scanned, uploaded, and synced across all federal branches. Within 6 minutes, Rick Lawton's profile was scrubbed. His clearance was revoked. His login credentials are locked. His biometric access was denied. The badge code he once wore on his chest now triggered a red security alert. No announcement was made. There was no alert sent to his phone. He wouldn't know he had been erased until he tried to be seen. Maya closed her terminal, her fingers not lingering on the keys. She didn't have to explain anything to anyone, not anymore. This wasn't vengeance. It was recalibration. The system had once turned its face away from its disease. Now it had started treating itself, one false credential at a time. Across town, Rick attempted to access the personnel dashboard from his home. The site greeted him with a gray banner, "Access denied. Invalid credentials." He tried again, this time logging into his remote tactical assessment portal, a spinning wheel. Then, profile not found. He checked the SWAT internal chat room. Gone. His username no longer existed. He called his precinct contact. The line went to voicemail. He emailed the department's help desk. It bounced back. Then, at 6:17 p.m., he received a single push notification from the federal personnel system. Rick Lawton, your status has been updated. Contact administrator for further information. No further explanation. No appeal link. No human voice on the other end. Rick's hands trembled, not from rage, but from the vacuum forming where his identity used to live. For 12 years he had moved through corridors like a wolf in uniform, speaking in commands, walking in intimidation, and now, with one unnoticed flaw exposed, the entire illusion crumbled in silence. Maya sat still, the file folder now closed in front of her. She didn't look proud. She didn't look pleased. She looked done, in the clearest, cleanest sense of the word. Justice, for her, didn't need a stage or audience. It needed finality, and a name erased from every ledger it had once infected. There was no announcement. No drum roll, no collective gasp echoing across a courtroom. It began instead in a quiet conference room lined with policy books and institutional silence, the kind only bureaucratic justice could produce. Maya sat at the head of a long table, a single document before her, crisp and heavy with history. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The weight of that paper spoke volume. The document was an internal memo, unearthed from a recovered archive, time-stamped 7 years prior. It had been sent to his squad, half laughed off, half applauded. It was the kind of filth dressed up as swagger, the kind that stains deeper than blood. Maya read it once more in silence. She then reached for a second sheet, this one new, not old, not dusty. Her name sat printed in formal ink at the bottom. She added her signature again. This page bore a simple directive. Effective immediately, the name Rick Lawton is no longer authorized for use in any training, documentation, or institutional citation within the federal law enforcement system. Her tone when she spoke was not commanding, it was final. "This is not symbolic," she said to the committee. "It is structural. You do not let mold linger in the foundation and expect the house to stay clean." Around the table, heads nodded, some solemn, some relieved. No one questioned the move. The vote was unanimous. The name was to be purged. Not redacted, not marked with an asterisk, purged. Across the country, emails began to land in inboxes with subject lines like curriculum revision, personnel removal notice. Police academies, internal knowledge banks, and federal law libraries all received the order. One by one, modules were opened, files updated, and names erased. In some instances, the name Rick Lawton was embedded in footnotes, cited in case studies, and once used as tactical benchmarks. Now, those references were replaced with a sterile substitute, Subject X. removed per Directive FJ9. In less than a day, the digital presence of a man who had once strutted through force briefings like a god was, pixel by pixel, syllable by syllable, wiped out. Rick didn't hear about it from a formal source. No call, no warning. He only realized when he tried to log into a retired training portal out of sheer muscle memory. Access denied. Username not recognized. When he emailed support, the automated reply was sterile. No record of this credential exists. He stared at the screen for 5 minutes, breath uneven, cursor blinking like a flat line. For a man who had once screamed down suspects from the barrel of a gun, silence was the sharpest edge. In his former department's hallway, there had once been a plaque titled Legacy of Tactical Leadership. His face was third from the top, frozen mid-yell, a pose he had chosen himself during a PR shoot. The maintenance crew removed it without ceremony, unfastening each screw like peeling off old wallpaper. The wall didn't miss him. No one did. A new plaque was installed 2 days later, a clean design, a modern ethos. No photos, just principle. Maya never watched any of it happen. She didn't need to. Her role was never about a public spectacle. Her victory wasn't about applause or coverage or headlines. She had only one intention, that systems remember what they allow, and systems correct what they once let thrive. Rick's name wasn't just erased because he was corrupt. It was erased because he had been institutionalized, protected, and cited as best practice. That was the true rot. He stood by her window in the evening, fingers gently brushing the spine of an ethics handbook she'd once edited. She hadn't added her name to the front cover then. It hadn't felt necessary. But tonight, as the news of the purge rolled silently through the corridors of law enforcement, she finally wrote her initials in the inside jacket, not out of pride, but out of responsibility. She would be the footnote now, quiet, present, unshakable. In a small town outside the city, one of Rick's old trainees received the update on his work tablet. He stared at the system flag next to Rick's name. Remove per directive. His thumb hovered over the link. He remembered the man's voice, the commands barked in drills, the sarcasm, the cruel jokes passed off as grit. He remembered once thinking, this is what strength looks like. Now he clicked Acknowledge Update and closed the tab. He didn't speak about it to anyone, but that night, for the first time in months, he called his sister and told her he'd sign up for Maya's ethics course. Rick, meanwhile, found himself increasingly invisible, not just to systems, but to people. One by one, the platforms that had once carried his quotes, reposted his one-liners, clipped his workshop lectures, removed the content or flagged it with quiet disclaimers. Content removed due to policy violation. Speaker disavowed by governing body. The digital graveyard he was buried in was deep and cold and silent. But worst of all, it was deserved. He tried to fight back once, hired a lawyer to send a cease and desist to one of the academies for removing his legacy material. The lawyer dropped the case after reviewing the directive and the files that Maya had made public. There's no legacy to protect, the response read. There is only compliance. The email had no sign-off, just a timestamp. Rick stopped trying. Maya, on the other hand, moved forward. She began drafting new federal guidelines for handling institutional misconduct. This time, her name was printed boldly on the first page. No more shadow roles. No more being the voice they asked for in back rooms but ignored on the record. She was no longer an advisor. She was the policy. The final line of the directive that erased Rick's name read simply, "The removal of reference is not an erasure of truth. It is a cleansing of the standard." And so it was. The training videos that had once opened with his face were replaced by a still screen that said, "This module is under revision for ethical compliance." That was all. No apology, no drama, just process, because that's what the system had become. Not fast, not loud, but irreversible. The silence in Rick Lawton's apartment was the kind that clung to walls, thick and unmoving, like dust after demolition. He shut the door behind him without thought, the echo barely registering as he tossed his keys onto the counter, the sound bouncing back off cheap plaster like an insult. The place was a rental, furnished poorly, forgotten by time, just like him. He didn't bother turning on the lights. The glow from a flickering street lamp bled through the cracked blinds, casting long, fractured shadows across the bare floor. Rick's boots thudded dully against the wood, but even they sounded like they no longer believed in his presence. He moved to the mirror above the sink in the corner kitchenette, an old rusted thing with grime in the corners and a frame warped by humidity. What looked back at him was not a man he knew. No badge, no insignia, no crisp collar or armored stance, just a figure with slumped shoulders, a 5-day stubble crawling up his jawline, and eyes that looked like they had slept in punishment rather than peace. He leaned in. The mirror didn't blink. It didn't offer memory or mercy, only truth, unvarnished and brutal. Once, he had delivered lectures about posture and presence, about the power of fear, the control of perception. He had told cadets that mirrors were weapons if you knew how to control your reflection. But this one didn't obey. This one reflected not authority, but a void. He raised a hand, hesitated, then touched the glass. It was cold. He wasn't. The glass didn't tremble. He did. He moved to the fold-up table in the corner where his laptop waited. It used to boot straight into his training modules. Hundreds of officers had clicked play on his words, taken notes from his aggression, and shaped their patrol patterns on his philosophy of street dominance. He powered it on. The password screen loaded. He entered his credentials twice. Error. Access denied. He paused, tried again, slower this time, another rejection. A final attempt. The screen blinked red. Account revoked. User not recognized. He shut the laptop, but it felt more like slamming a coffin. It had all been stripped. The academy, the programs, the archives. His voice had been deleted. He had trained them how to shout. Now he wasn't allowed to speak. His phone vibrated. He grabbed it like a weapon, as if expecting orders to return. Instead, it was a notification from his bank. Deposit from city payroll canceled. Account flagged pending review. No salary, no pension, just a lockout. A second buzz followed. His wife's name appeared on the screen, or rather, the legal name he hadn't said out loud in months. The message was 4 words: the papers are filed. He didn't open the attachment. He didn't have to. Divorce was a headline, not a surprise. The third buzz was quieter, almost hesitant. It came from a number he once knew by heart, his daughter. The message preview stabbed through his cornea. I'm removing your name from our family tree. Don't contact me. No emojis. No dad. Just finality. He stared at the message. It stared back, unflinching. In all his lectures, he had said the world was divided between those who pulled the trigger and those who hesitated. Turns out, silence was the worst executioner of all. He stood there for a long time, not thinking, not regretting, just processing the absence. He moved to the bedroom, not out of routine, but necessity. The drawer where his old ID once lay was empty. He had burned it the night Maya made it obsolete. It had felt like control then. Now it felt like deletion. He opened his closet, half empty. His wife had taken her half, cleanly. No clothes remained from his academy days. Just civilian rags, colorless and bland. No uniform, no armor, no rank. He reached for the bookshelf where his certificates had once hung in polished frames. Gone. Just clean the wall where glory used to stand. The frames had been tossed during his last argument. He remembered smashing the glass himself. Now he couldn't remember what they even said. His fingers ran along the paint, stopping at a chip in the wall. He pressed it, like it might open a door back in time. It didn't. He returned to the mirror. This time, he didn't move closer, he just stared. The reflection no longer looked unfamiliar. It looked accurate. Rick Lawton, the man without a title, the man without a platform, the man whose words had once trained battalions, now couldn't get through a login screen. His name wasn't in the academy. It wasn't in the manuals. It wasn't in the department registry. He had shouted it once, Rick Lawton, like a brand. like a war cry. Now it was noise, no longer feared, no longer respected, just forgotten. He thought about calling someone, a colleague, a friend, but the list in his contacts was short. Those still in uniform wouldn't answer. Those who had left the force had already erased him. He typed 3 digits, then backspaced them. No one would come. Not for him, not anymore. His hands curled into fists. The same fists that had once been tools of control. He had trained them to instill fear, but now in this room, they trembled. They didn't punch. They folded. They hid. He placed them on the sink, leaned over, and closed his eyes. His breathing slowed, but it didn't steady. The man who once barked orders at recruits couldn't command his lungs. There were no sirens. No pounding at the door, just the quiet tick of a wall clock he hadn't noticed until now. Every second was a reminder. He had once spent time in interrogation rooms. Now, he was a prisoner to it. He sat on the bed and looked at the phone again. His daughter's message remained. No, I love you. No, maybe one day. Just erasure. It was colder than any disciplinary report, more final than any sentence. He had lost the right to his history. There was a drawer under the bed where he kept old mementos, coins, badges, a few photos. He pulled it open, empty. His wife had cleared it, or maybe he had. He couldn't remember. That was the worst part, not the loss, but the gaps, the hollow places where memory used to live. He stood once more, walked to the window, and pulled the curtain aside. The street below was quiet. Anonymous cars passed. A man walked his dog. A couple laughed under dim lights. The world went on. Without him, without even notice. He didn't speak, didn't cry. The apartment didn't echo with grief. It just stood, indifferent, like the system he once served, like the people he once commanded, like the mirror that didn't lie. Rick Lawton turned away from the window. He didn't turn off the light. He didn't close the laptop. He didn't answer the phone. He simply sat on the floor, back against the wall, knees up, eyes open. The mirror remained across from him, watching, still, and in it a man sat facing nothing. A man whose name had meant something once. Now, it meant less than zero. The applause didn't echo. It rose, steady and sure, like something unspoken finally being acknowledged. When Maya Rollins stepped down from the small, unadorned podium at the Federal Ethics Law Conference, she did not smile. She didn't wave. Her hands remained by her side, firm, still, as if holding the weight of years in silence. No notes in front of her, no teleprompter, just her voice, clean and sharpened by principle. She had spoken barely 50 words. But each syllable landed like a measured strike. A woman who had spent her career enduring volumes of noise didn't need volume to make an impact. Her closing statement still floated in the air, resonant in its restraint. Some names aren't worth remembering, but the conduct that allowed them to exist, that we must engrave deep, so we don't ever make room for it again. There was no follow-up question, there was no panel discussion. No one wanted to dilute what had just been said. She walked off stage, not to the celebration, but to a hush that felt reverent. In a space often cluttered with policy jargon and self-congratulatory speeches, Maya had given the one thing no one expected: clarity without cruelty, justice without vengeance. Rick Lawton's name didn't pass her lips once, but his shadow trembled across every syllable. Because she didn't need to name him, she had already named the truth. Somewhere, deep in the archived footage, Lawton's voice still lived, spitting venom on internal recordings, barking commands behind closed-door trainings, throwing off slurs like jokes to an audience too afraid or too complicit to laugh. But now, those echoes were isolated, archived, flagged, no longer in rotation, no longer a part of any certified training material, manual, or academy resource. The institutions that once praised his firm hand now call it by its true name: misconduct, unchecked and institutionalized. The screen behind Maya had stayed dark during her address. No slides, no evidence reels, no breakdowns of metrics or improvement curves, just her. And that was intentional, because the point wasn't to show data, it was to show spine. And for the first time in years, the roomful of legal advisors, ethics officers, and system architects wasn't watching a case study. They were watching accountability personified. Outside the conference hall, reporters scrambled to reframe their angles. They wanted a soundbite. They wanted her to say his name. But when asked again, offstage in a quieter hallway, lined with security and staffers, Maya only said, "If I say it, I validate it." And there's nothing left to validate. Her assistant stood nearby, holding a copy of the new federal ethics guidelines, revised, republished, and rolled out nationwide just 2 weeks prior. In its index, the name Rick Lawton was absent. In its introduction, however, one line stood bold, printed in clean serif ink. Power without scrutiny creates culture. Culture without conscience creates collapse. No one in the room asked who wrote the line. They didn't need to. The entire structure of the updated code bore Maya's mark. Succinct, unmoved, and quietly furious. Elsewhere, whispers still floated. Discussions among precincts, debates in legal forums, late-night calls between retired officers. Some argued she had gone too far, that erasing someone was its kind of brutality. But those voices rang hollow, because Maya hadn't erased Rick Lawton. She had simply stopped feeding the illusion that he was ever bigger than the system that protected him. She had removed the mask, and beneath it was no legacy, no foundation. Just a man who mistook fear for respect, control for service, and noise for worth. At an Ivy League law school, a young student cited her speech in a thesis about post-symbolic justice, the idea that sometimes the most ethical act isn't to punish but to refrain from retaliation altogether. The student quoted Maya's exact phrase, "Power isn't what we do when we win, it's how quiet we can be when we don't need to shout anymore." The professor, who once clerked for a justice known for his hardline stances, underlined that sentence twice. Meanwhile, Rick's name continued to vanish, not with fire or flare, but by omission. Email chains no longer auto-suggested. Archived footage is no longer tagged with it. Training schedules that once featured him as a case study in tactical discipline now replaced his chapter with a different one, The Cost of Unquestioned Command. No author was credited. But again, the pen that wrote it needed no credit. There were no riots. No news headlines shouting absolutes, just slow administrative silences, requests for background checks that returned empty, search results that came back null, a resume that wouldn't load. One by one, the elements that had built a man's career folded into nothing, not with rage, but with resignation. And as Maya boarded her train out of D.C. later that evening, she sat by the window, not touching her phone once. The copy of the ethics report rested on her lap, unopened. She stared out at the city disappearing behind her, and for the first time in years there was no file waiting for her to defend, no report needing revision, no system demanding she shout just to be heard. In her silence, something far louder was being said, because sometimes the loudest statement isn't a roar, it's the decision to never say the name again. The newly printed edition of the National Law Enforcement Ethics Manual arrived at precincts across the country in unmarked cardboard boxes. Standard government issue, simple, utilitarian, impersonal. But when officers peeled the tape and cracked open the stiff spine of the volume, something different greeted them. The weight of the book hadn't changed, but the gravity of its contents had. A new chapter, nestled quietly between procedural updates and case law citations, bearing a title that offered no drama, no vengeance, no all-caps indictment, only balance. The Enforcer and the Boundaries of Power. The introduction was written in a voice that carried neither pride nor pity. It stated facts. It chronicled missteps. It examined the quiet complicity of systems built on unchecked authority. The name Rick Lawton appeared nowhere, yet every paragraph was built on the blueprint of his rise and fall. His story was preserved not to shame, not to mourn, but to remind. The chapter unfolded methodically. First came the behavior, documented patterns of verbal abuse, tactical overreach, and deliberate marginalization of vulnerable civilians. Next followed the institutional responses, or lack thereof, across time. Year by year, the timeline revealed how internal memos had been dismissed, how disciplinary recommendations had been watered down, and how early warnings had been shelved in the name of departmental unity. Then came the shift, the moment where silence became scrutiny. Without melodrama, without accusatory rhetoric, the narrative turned toward accountability. The independent audits, the retrieval of redacted files, the emergence of first-hand testimony once disregarded. Not once did the chapter descend into character assassination. There were no adjectives of rage, no metaphors of war, just facts, just a clean dissection of power misused and power reclaimed. On the final page of the chapter, beneath the citations and procedural footnotes, sat a line in a different font, smaller, italicized, but centered. You do not need to remember the name of who failed. You must remember why they were removed. That sentence wasn't indexed. It wasn't referenced elsewhere in the book. It simply existed as closing punctuation to a reckoning long overdue. The name of the chapter's contributor was listed at the top of the section, Maya Rollins. No titles, no accolades, just the name of a person who had witnessed, endured, documented, and acted. She had not inserted herself into the text. There were no personal pronouns, no narrative interruptions to note her role. The work wasn't a memoir, it was doctrine. In academies nationwide, cadets flipped through this chapter during ethics training. Instructors paused at key phrases. Law is not license. Fear is not control. Oversight is not betrayal, and asked the room for discussion. Young men and women, many of them new to power, sat with discomfort. They questioned, challenged, and reflected, but they could not dismiss. Because the manual didn't accuse, it showed, it taught. Some veterans in the room, hardened by decades in uniform, resisted the tone. "This is revisionist," one said at a precinct seminar. The ethics facilitator didn't argue. She simply pointed to the line Maya had written and asked, "If it were your name, would you want the system to remember you or your failure?" Silence. At headquarters in Washington, a framed page from the new manual was mounted near the entrance of the Office for Lawful Conduct Oversight. Not the entire chapter, just that final line. Officers passed it each morning. No one commented, but none could ignore it. In the weeks that followed, retired personnel contacted the Oversight Board, some to clarify past incidents, some to confess buried knowledge. Maya received none of those calls directly. She had made her role clear. She was not the collector of guilt, she was the architect of reform. Her office remained the same. No new plaques, no interviews, no book tours. She refused panel invitations from media outlets eager to crown her a crusader. To her, the work was never about the fall of a man. It was about the rise of a standard. One evening, she returned to the conference center where she had delivered her most quoted sentence. The hall was empty. A janitor swept quietly. She stood at the edge of the stage, remembering the quiet that had followed her speech, not the applause, but the breathless stillness. She didn't need that stillness to return. She just needed it to echo. A young officer approached her near the coat racks, unsure if it was appropriate to speak. "I read your chapter," she said. "Made me think differently about the badge." Maya nodded, not warmly, not coldly, just enough. The young woman added, "We used to think being feared was proof we mattered. Now I think maybe being questioned means we're real." That, Maya knew, was the point. Elsewhere, in precincts where Lawton's face had once graced training posters and motivational reels, blank spaces hung on the walls, not as erasure, but as placeholders, symbols of a culture that was finally willing to ask itself what it honored and why. And in those spaces, new images slowly took root. Not faces, not slogans, but diagrams of policy. Flowcharts of accountability, quotes from the manual, not attributed, just absorbed. History, Maya believed, didn't need martyrs. It needed memory, not of names, but of choices, of thresholds crossed and questions unasked. And so she let the chapter stand, not as a weapon, not as a trophy, just as a mark, a single, clear, irreversible mark that power, unchecked, will always write its expiration date, but justice, when patient, will always write the rest. A year passed like dust settling in a house no longer lived in. Rick Lawton now resided in a low-rent apartment complex 2 blocks from a highway ramp, where no one knew him and no one cared to. His mailbox bore no name, just a peeling unit number in rusted brass. The neighbors nodded out of routine, not recognition. They didn't whisper. He wasn't feared anymore. He was forgotten. Inside, the furniture was mismatched, worn, and borrowed. A badge-shaped stain on one shelf remained, the only echo of what used to rest there. The TV played muted sports reruns. His phone rarely buzzed. When it did, it was junk mail or a wrong number. The last message from his daughter still sat unread. He hadn't dared open it since the day she'd erased him from her life. Online, he was a meme now. A clip of him from years ago, in full uniform, barking orders, had been turned into a soundbite overlaid with children's cartoons mocking fake authority. He watched it once on a public TV inside a laundromat, laundry soap dripping from his hand. No one looked at him, but the cashier locked the detergent cabinet after he left. His name had become a trigger word in high school civics classes, a case study of excess and collapse. His face used in multiple choice tests to identify what not to do in power. One day he passed a mural downtown, a massive one, painted across a brick wall near a courthouse. It showed silhouettes of unnamed figures standing tall while shadows fell behind them, twisted and contorted, clutching badges that melted into chains. His outline was unmistakably among them, not because it was labeled, but because his posture had once been that proud, that loud, and now it could only be recognized by its failure to stand. A police recruiter he once mentored crossed the street to avoid him, pretending to take a phone call. Rick saw the tremor in the man's hand as he held the phone upside down. Later, someone spray-painted a quote beside the mural, "Real power leaves no bruises you can't name." He didn't know if it was meant for him, but it held his weight all the same. The grocery store across from his building began a facial recognition test program, and while the technology wasn't flawless, it flagged him on entry twice. Both times he was asked to wait by the security desk. Both times he left without buying anything. Once, a teenager held the door open for an elderly man, then saw Rick behind them and let it swing shut. Not out of spite, it was more reflex. Like the body instinctively avoids heat long after the fire's gone. On a message board he once frequented, someone posted a deep fake of him crying, layered over courtroom footage that had never existed. The post had 3 million views and over 40,000 comments. Some were jokes. Others were not. Someone wrote, "If justice were a person, this would be her first real smile." He didn't log in again. At night he paced his apartment, the windows closed, the curtains tighter with each passing week. He rearranged his books, but didn't read them. Their covers held the names of people who still had theirs. In the mirror, he saw a man who had once filled space with noise, now reduced to watching the fridge light flicker because he couldn't sleep, and the silence wasn't enough to make him feel safe. He tried once to re-enter the forum for tactical response training he used to moderate, but his login was revoked and the page redirected to a disclaimer. This site no longer recognizes affiliations with individuals removed from active duty due to ethical violations. No photo, no appeal. Just that line. His application for a part-time job at a local security firm was rejected within 4 hours. The HR email cited reputational risk. He hadn't even made it to the interview. In another attempt, he volunteered to speak at a community college, offering a session on conflict resolution under pressure. They never replied. The woman in charge of booking speakers had written a piece years ago, titled "Silence Speaks Louder, What Abuse of Power Taught Me About Listening." He remembered her name. She had once stood in the back of one of his training sessions, notebook in hand, asking no questions. Now, her work was in the ethics module that replaced his slides. He watched it once through a second-hand login. She ended with, "We don't erase the past to forget it. We erase names to remember the cost." He didn't press replay. One evening, his building's fire alarm triggered. Everyone filed out to the parking lot, annoyed and shivering in their pajamas. When Rick appeared at the exit, A woman instinctively pulled her child closer. The boy, maybe 7, asked, "Is that the man on TV?" The mother didn't answer. She just turned her son's face away. Rick stood in the cold a moment longer than everyone else before going back inside. The elevator made a sharp sound as it opened, like it didn't want to hold his weight. The walls in his unit had cracks now. Not from anything dramatic, just time, water, and the kind of slow neglect that doesn't scream for attention but accumulates like regret. He spent his nights seated in a folding chair by the window, watching the city blink and shut itself down in increments. He counted lights. He counted headlines that no longer mentioned him. He counted the apologies he never received, and then he counted the ones he never gave. Then, one morning, his phone lit up again. A single message. Not from a contact, no name, just the preview line. It was short. The preview line read, "I meant it." He never tapped further. One morning, a young journalist found the address. She waited outside for nearly 2 hours before Rick opened the door, squinting as if daylight itself had betrayed him. She introduced herself, voice soft, recorder visible but not yet on. "Mr. Lawton," she said, "just one question. If you had the chance, what would you say to the people you shouted down? To the ones you hurt?" Rick didn't blink. His jaw twitched. The camera light blinked red. He stared straight ahead, past the lens, past the woman, past the world, and he said nothing. The silence stretched. She waited. He didn't. And eventually she lowered the mic. The footage would run later that week, 20 seconds long. No edits, no music, just a disgraced man faced with the possibility of redemption, or at least remorse, and offering not a single word in return. Not because he wasn't allowed to speak, but because silence had finally found him, and he had nothing left to drown it out. It had started weeks earlier, when a true crime documentary mistakenly referenced him in an episode about systemic misconduct. His name wasn't even mentioned directly, just a blurred badge on a case file, time-stamped during his tenure. But the internet didn't need full names. Screenshots circulated within hours. A side-by-side comparison with an old clip of him giving orders in riot gear surfaced. It took just a day for the hashtag #StillStandingWrong to trend, with overlays of his voice slurred into parody by amateur remixers. A week later, a coffee shop he occasionally walked past repainted its front wall, covering graffiti that read, "Some power should rust." No one accused him directly. No one had to. The barista once nodded at him. She didn't anymore. The nod had calcified into a glance sideways, one that checked the doorframe as if calculating the time it would take to shut him out. His local library removed 3 books on law enforcement tactics from the shelves, all previously noted in his footnotes during guest lectures. When he asked why, the clerk simply said, "Outdated editions." He watched the books in the donation bin outside 2 days later, spines up, untouched in the rain. The sidewalk chalk drawn nearby spelled, "If the past stinks, stop airing it out." He never went back. In a grocery aisle, he reached for a box of cereal only to feel a phone snap a picture behind him. He turned, caught the eyes of a teenager with a knowing smirk and no apology. That image, him half-turned, hand still outstretched, was uploaded with the caption, "Still shopping like nothing happened." It became a sticker on Telegram. The caption never needed context. The face did the rest. He once tried to attend a local town hall, not to speak, but to sit and listen. A veteran officer was speaking on mental health support for first responders. As Rick entered, late and unnoticed, the speaker's voice faltered, then regained momentum, then stopped entirely. The officer looked out, scanned the room, saw him, and closed the folder. "We can't begin healing," he said, "until we've taken the infections seriously." That night, Rick walked 3 miles home. His shoes were soaked in street light and old guilt. He said nothing, reported nothing. The silence had followed him back, and seemed to sit in the passenger seat of his mind, more familiar than fear. The once buzzy forums he used to frequent had changed names. Some didn't exist. Others had evolved, their landing pages populated by newer faces, younger voices, different rhetoric. He attempted to submit an opinion piece anonymously, an argument about procedural missteps, thinly veiled advice drawn from his past, but the moderators flagged his IP. The submission was rejected with a single line: "We do not publish ghosts." He didn't try again. When his water heater burst, he phoned the landlord. The call rang 5 times. Then a voice, rushed and brittle: "It's been handled." He hadn't said his name, but they had known. It was always like that now. People responded as if avoiding a trap door, like his voice might pull them into some old controversy that still stained the floor beneath their names. The repairman arrived, replaced the unit, and left a receipt on the counter. The signature line was blank, not unsigned, just unneeded. Rick stared at it for hours, not out of confusion, but because it was the cleanest rejection he'd ever received. The silence became a pattern. First, a pause in conversations when he passed, then a sliver of stillness between sounds at home, like his rooms knew not to echo. Even his phone, once a lifeline to the world he'd helped shape, now vibrated only with system alerts, software updates, privacy policy changes, algorithm adjustments. The digital world was moving without him, shedding him like an outdated skin. He watched, powerless, as a new version of everything uncoiled and restructured without space for his voice, his face, or his name. One night he tried speaking aloud to no one in particular, just testing the sound of his voice against the walls. It cracked halfway through a sentence, not from emotion, but from lack of use. He coughed, paused, tried again. The words came scattered and small. They didn't fill the room. They didn't settle. They didn't echo. He remembered yelling once, into radios, into faces, into silence, and how those words once ricocheted like rubber bullets. Now, they dropped like coins into a well, making no sound at all. It was that silence the journalist had brought back with her, not as a weapon, but as a mirror. She didn't ask for an apology, just a sentence, a recognition, a breath that mattered. But Rick gave her nothing, not because he didn't have words, not because he wasn't allowed to speak, but because silence had finally found him, and he had nothing left to drown it out. Elsewhere, the sun spilled gently across a quiet city park. Maya Rollins sat on a wooden bench with her legs crossed, a hardcover resting across her lap, unread. She wasn't reading that day. Her eyes were closed, her breath steady, not asleep, just still. The pages moved slightly in the wind, but her hands didn't. Beside her, a woman with a baby in a carrier leaned over and said, "You were on TV last year. The judge, right? From the Lawton case?" Maya opened her eyes, slowly. "Yes." The woman hesitated. "Aren't you scared he might come back?" Maya's face didn't shift. Her voice remained calm, nearly warm. "I've never feared men who yell. I watch those who can't look at what they've done." There was no triumph in her tone, no venom. It wasn't a jab. It was a truth spoken not for defense, but as doctrine. The woman nodded, not knowing what to say. Maya smiled faintly, more to herself than to anyone else, and returned to her stillness. The bench creaked lightly as the wind picked up, leaves rustled. A child laughed nearby. Life, unbothered, moved on. That afternoon, across social media and news channels, clips of the journalist's footage circulated. Many shared it not for the words, but the lack thereof. Sometimes the loudest confession, one tweet read, is when there's nothing left to say. Comment sections flooded with reactions, some scathing, some contemplative, but none defending the silence. Not even Rick's former supporters. Even they understood now. He hadn't been silenced. He had been revealed. The ethics board issued no new statements. Maya gave no further interviews. The manual wasn't revised again. It didn't need to be. Justice had already spoken, and then it stopped speaking, because it didn't need to prove itself anymore. Not through punishment, not through spectacle, only through presence. In precincts around the country, new cadets were asked to reflect on what they'd read, seen, and heard, or hadn't heard. One instructor wrote a prompt on the board. What does it mean when even shame refuses to speak? No one answered immediately, but the room stayed quiet longer than usual. Back in his apartment, Rick sat alone, lights dim, curtains drawn. The clip had gone viral. He hadn't watched it, but he knew. The camera always outlasts the voice, and now his voice was no longer needed by anyone. No agency reached out, no friend called. No one asked for his side. And that, perhaps, was the final sentence he'd never expected. Not an indictment, but an absence. In the final lines of a letter Maya never mailed, written long before the hearing, she had scribbled something that never left her mind. Some men believe justice means being heard, but sometimes justice is unheard, and there's no way to stop it. She tore the letter up that same day, not out of anger, but completion. There was nothing more to explain, nothing more to resolve. The story hadn't ended. It had transitioned from noise to consequence, from presence to precedent, and in the end, the silence said everything.